Officer Mike Rodriguez had been patrolling the quiet suburban streets of Millbrook for 8 years, but he had never seen anything like what was about to unfold on this seemingly ordinary Tuesday morning. His partner, Officer Sarah Chen, sat in the passenger seat reviewing their shift reports while Mike navigated their patrol car through the tree-lined neighborhoods where nothing exciting ever happened. The radio crackled with routine calls, a noise complaint on Elm Street, a minor fender bender near the shopping center, and reports of a suspicious van that had been parked in the same spot for 3 days. Mike and Sarah decided to check out the van first as it was closest to their current location. Neither officer could have imagined that this simple decision would change their lives forever. Meanwhile, 12-year-old twins Emma and Lily Parker were getting ready for school in their modest 2-story home, just 4 blocks away from where the mysterious van sat parked. The girls had always been close, finishing each other's sentences and sharing that special bond that only twins understand. Their golden retriever, Max, bounded around their feet as they packed their backpacks, his tail wagging with the boundless energy that only dogs possess. Their mother, Janet Parker, called from the kitchen for them to hurry up or they would be late for school. She was a single mother who worked double shifts as a nurse at the local hospital to make ends meet. Janet had raised the twins to be independent and responsible, never imagining that these qualities would soon be put to the ultimate test. The van in question belonged to 3 escaped convicts who had been planning their next move for weeks. Danny the Torch Morrison, a known arsonist with a violent streak, had convinced his cellmates Rick Henderson and Tommy Walsh to join him in a desperate plan. They had escaped from the state penitentiary during a prisoner transport gone wrong, and now they were hiding out, planning to steal enough money to flee the country. Danny had earned his nickname through his disturbing habit of setting fires to cover his tracks after committing crimes. He believed that fire destroyed all evidence, and he took a twisted pleasure in watching flames consume everything in their path. Rick was the muscle of the group, a former boxer turned armed robber who had spent most of his adult life behind bars. Tommy was the youngest and most nervous of the 3, constantly worried about getting caught and sent back to prison. The 3 men had been watching the patrol patterns of the local police for days, noting when officers made their rounds and identifying the quietest streets where they were least likely to be spotted. They had chosen this particular neighborhood because it seemed sleepy and safe, the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked and trusted their neighbors completely. As Mike and Sarah approached the suspicious van, they followed standard procedure. Sarah radioed in their location while Mike parked their patrol car at a safe distance. The van appeared empty, but both officers had learned never to make assumptions. They had seen too many routine calls turn dangerous when proper caution wasn't exercised. Unknown to the officers, all 3 escaped convicts were hiding in the back of the van, watching through tinted windows as the police car approached. Danny's hands were already reaching for the gasoline containers they had stolen from a service station the night before. Rick gripped a stolen pistol, his knuckles white with tension. Tommy's hands shook as he held a roll of duct tape, dreading what they might have to do next. The morning air was crisp and clean, with the scent of blooming flowers from nearby gardens, mixing with the smell of fresh coffee drifting from kitchen windows. Children could be heard laughing and playing in backyards, their voices carrying the innocent joy that comes with not understanding the dangers that exist in the world. Emma and Lily Parker grabbed their lunch bags and kissed their mother goodbye, promising to come straight home after school. Max followed them to the front door, whining softly because he couldn't accompany them on their walk to school. The dog had always been protective of the twins, and somehow he seemed to sense that this day would be different from all the others. As the girls stepped outside, they noticed the police car parked down the street near the van that had been sitting there for days. Emma, who was naturally curious about everything around her, pointed it out to her sister. Lily, who was more cautious by nature, suggested they take their usual route to school and not get involved in whatever was happening. But fate had other plans for everyone involved in this unfolding drama. Mike approached the van slowly, his hand resting on his service weapon while Sarah positioned herself to provide backup. They had done this countless times before, checking out suspicious vehicles and talking to people who seemed out of place in the neighborhood. Most of the time, these calls resulted in nothing more than giving directions to lost tourists or telling someone to move their legally parked car. The van's engine was cold, suggesting it had been parked there overnight. Mike noticed that the license plate was partially obscured by mud, which raised his suspicion level. Sarah observed that all the windows were tinted too darkly for local regulations, another red flag that suggested this vehicle deserved closer inspection. Neither officer noticed the small hole that had been cut in the van's rear door, allowing the men inside to see out while remaining hidden from view. Danny Morrison watched every move the officers made, calculating the best moment to spring their trap. He had no intention of going back to prison, and he was prepared to do whatever it took to ensure his freedom. The peaceful suburban morning was about to explode into chaos, and the lives of 2 dedicated police officers and 2 innocent schoolgirls would intersect in ways that none of them could have predicted. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test courage, loyalty, and the unbreakable bonds between sisters who refused to abandon those in need. As Mike reached for the van's door handle, the last normal moment of this extraordinary day slipped away forever, replaced by events that would be talked about in Millbrook for generations to come. The van's rear doors exploded open without warning, and 3 desperate men emerged like wild animals bursting from a cage. Officer Mike Rodriguez barely had time to reach for his radio before Rick Henderson's massive fist connected with his jaw, sending him crashing to the ground. The impact was so sudden and violent that Mike's vision blurred instantly, and he tasted blood in his mouth. Officer Sarah Chen spun around at the sound of the commotion, her hand moving instinctively toward her weapon, but Tommy Walsh was already behind her. Despite being the youngest of the 3 convicts, Tommy moved with surprising speed and desperation. He wrapped his arms around Sarah's neck in a chokehold, cutting off her air supply and making it impossible for her to call for backup. Danny Morrison stood in the middle of the chaos like a conductor orchestrating a symphony of violence. His eyes gleamed with the same twisted excitement he felt when watching his fires burn. This was the moment he had been planning for weeks, and everything was going exactly as he had envisioned. Mike struggled to get back on his feet, but Rick's boot caught him in the ribs before he could stand. The pain shot through his body like lightning, and he doubled over, gasping for breath. Rick had learned to fight in prison, where showing mercy meant showing weakness, and he applied those brutal lessons now with ruthless efficiency. Sarah fought desperately against Tommy's chokehold, using her police training to try to break free, but the young convict held on with the strength that comes from knowing that failure means a lifetime behind bars. Her vision started to go dark around the edges as oxygen failed to reach her brain, and her struggles became weaker by the second. The entire attack lasted less than 30 seconds, but to the 2 officers it felt like an eternity. Their patrol car's radio crackled with routine communications from dispatch, completely unaware that 2 of their officers were being overpowered just yards away from their vehicle. Danny pulled out the duct tape and rope they had prepared for exactly this situation. He had thought through every detail of their plan, including what to do if they were discovered before they could execute their real crime. The officers would become their insurance policy, human shields to guarantee their escape when the time came. Mike's hands were yanked behind his back and secured with rope so tight that it cut into his wrists. The knots were tied by Rick, who had learned the skill during his time in various correctional facilities. These weren't the kind of restraints that could be easily slipped or broken. They were designed to hold. No matter how hard someone struggled, Sarah received the same treatment, her police training useless against 3 determined criminals who had nothing left to lose. The duct tape went over both officers' mouths, sealing in their ability to call for help or warn anyone who might come looking for them. The convicts dragged their captives to an abandoned warehouse that sat behind a row of overgrown trees at the edge of the neighborhood. Danny had scouted this location carefully, choosing it because it was isolated but close enough to their escape route. The building had been empty for years, ever since the small manufacturing company that once operated there had moved to another state. Inside the warehouse, the air smelled of dust, rust, and decay. Broken windows allowed shafts of morning sunlight to cut through the gloom, creating an eerie pattern of light and shadow across the concrete floor. Mike and Sarah were tied to metal support posts in the center of the building, positioned so they could see each other but were too far apart to provide any assistance. Rick stood guard while Tommy nervously paced back and forth, checking and rechecking the locks on the warehouse doors. The young criminal kept looking at his watch, counting down the minutes until their real plan would begin. He had never been involved in anything this serious before, and the weight of their actions was starting to crush his spirit. Danny, meanwhile, was preparing his favorite tools of destruction. He had spent years perfecting his knowledge of accelerants, learning which chemicals burned hottest and fastest. The gasoline they had stolen was just the beginning. He also carried containers of paint thinner and other flammable liquids that would ensure his fire burned with supernatural intensity. The warehouses, old wooden beams, and accumulated debris would provide perfect fuel for the blaze Danny was planning. He walked around the building like an artist studying a blank canvas, determining exactly where to place his accelerants for maximum effect. This would be his masterpiece, a fire so intense and all-consuming that it would destroy any evidence of their crimes. Mike and Sarah watched in growing horror as Danny prepared his materials. Both officers had seen the aftermath of arson fires during their careers, and they understood exactly what the escaped convict was planning. The duct tape over their mouths prevented them from pleading or trying to reason with their captors, leaving them helpless to do anything but wait for the inevitable. Outside the warehouse, life in the neighborhood continued at its normal peaceful pace. Parents were finishing their morning coffee before heading to work. Children were walking to school with backpacks bouncing on their shoulders, and dogs were being let out for their morning walks. None of them had any idea that two police officers were fighting for their lives just a few hundred yards away. Emma and Lily Parker had taken a different route to school that morning, curious about all the activity they had witnessed near the mysterious van. Instead of walking directly down Main Street as they usually did, they cut through the small park that bordered the abandoned warehouse district. This decision, made on the innocent whim of two 12-year-old girls, would prove to be the most important choice of their young lives. Max, their golden retriever, had somehow escaped from their backyard and was following their scent trail. The dog's protective instincts had kicked in when he sensed his beloved family members were heading toward danger, and he was determined to find them before something terrible happened. The three escaped convicts had no idea that their perfect plan was about to be discovered by two schoolgirls and their faithful dog. Danny continued spreading accelerants around the warehouse, humming softly to himself as he worked. Rick maintained his position by the door, confident that no one would think to look for them in this forgotten corner of the neighborhood. Tommy's nervousness was increasing by the minute, but his partners dismissed his concerns as weakness. The young convict couldn't shake the feeling that something was going wrong, that their luck was about to run out in the most spectacular way possible. As Danny finished his preparations and reached for his lighter, the sound of children's voices could be heard in the distance, growing closer with each passing second. Emma Parker heard the sound first, a muffled noise coming from inside the old warehouse that sounded almost like someone trying to speak through a thick blanket. She stopped walking and grabbed her twin sister's arm, holding up her hand for silence. The 12-year-old had always been blessed with exceptional hearing, a trait that often got her in trouble when she overheard conversations that weren't meant for her ears. Lily looked at her sister with confusion, unsure why they had stopped walking toward school. The abandoned warehouse had always been a source of curiosity for the neighborhood children, but their mother had strictly forbidden them from playing anywhere near the old building. She had warned them about broken glass, rusty metal, and the possibility that homeless people might be living inside. The sound came again, more clearly this time. Definitely human voices, but strangely distorted. Emma felt her heart begin to race as she realized that someone was inside the supposedly empty building. Her natural curiosity warred with her mother's warnings and her own common sense about staying away from potentially dangerous situations. Max appeared around the corner at that exact moment, his golden fur slightly matted from pushing through the overgrown bushes that surrounded the warehouse property. The dog immediately sensed that his beloved girls were upset about something, and his protective instincts kicked into high gear. His ears perked up and his nose twitched as he detected unfamiliar scents, the smell of fear, sweat, and something chemical that made his sensitive nose burn. Lily wanted to turn around and go straight to school, but Emma's curiosity had gotten the better of her. She approached one of the broken windows near the side of the building, moving as quietly as her sneakers would allow on the debris-scattered ground. Max followed close behind her, his body tense and alert for any sign of danger. What Emma saw through that dirty window would be burned into her memory for the rest of her life. Two police officers were tied up in the middle of the warehouse floor, their mouths covered with tape and their eyes wide with terror. One officer was a woman with short dark hair, and the other was a man who appeared to be injured based on the way he was slumped against his restraints. 3 men moved around the warehouse like predators circling their prey. The largest man stood near the door holding what looked like a gun. A younger man paced back and forth nervously, constantly checking his watch and looking toward the exits. But it was the third man who truly frightened Emma. He was pouring liquid from several containers around the base of the wooden support beams, and even from outside the building she could smell the sharp odor of gasoline. Emma's hand flew to her mouth to stifle a gasp of horror. She had watched enough television shows with her mother to understand exactly what she was witnessing. These men were planning to burn down the warehouse with the police officers still tied up inside. The realization hit her like a physical blow, making her feel sick to her stomach. She grabbed Lily's arm and pulled her sister away from the window, both girls crouching behind a pile of old concrete blocks that provided cover from anyone inside the building. Emma whispered frantically to her twin, trying to explain what she had seen without speaking loudly enough to alert the criminals to their presence. Lily's face went pale as she processed her sister's words. The cautious twin wanted to run home immediately and call for help, but Emma pointed out a crucial problem with that plan. Their house was 6 blocks away, and by the time they ran home, found their mother's phone, and convinced the police dispatcher that their story was true, the warehouse would already be engulfed in flames. Max seemed to understand the gravity of the situation even without hearing the girls' whispered conversation. The dog positioned himself between the twins and the warehouse, his body low to the ground and his ears flattened against his head. Every instinct he possessed was telling him that his family was in mortal danger. Inside the warehouse, Danny Morrison was putting the finishing touches on his accelerant pattern. He had created a web of flammable liquid that would ensure the fire spread quickly and burned hot enough to consume everything in its path. The arsonist felt the familiar rush of excitement that came just before he lit his fires, the anticipation of watching destruction unfold according to his careful planning. Mike Rodriguez had been working frantically to loosen his restraints, using every technique he had learned in police training for escaping from bonds. The rope was tight and professionally tied, but he had managed to create just enough slack to maintain hope that he might be able to free himself. However, time was running out faster than his progress was advancing. Sarah Chen was fighting her own battle against panic and despair. As a police officer, she had always known that her job carried inherent risks, but she had never imagined dying in such a helpless and terrifying way. She forced herself to stay calm and alert, looking for any opportunity to escape or signal for help. The criminals had made one crucial mistake in their planning. They had become so focused on the police officers and their escape route that they failed to maintain proper awareness of their surroundings. None of them noticed the small faces that had appeared briefly at the window, or the golden retriever that was now positioned like a sentinel outside their temporary prison. Emma made a decision that would define her character for the rest of her life. Instead of running away to safety, she chose to stay and try to help the trapped officers. She whispered her plan to Lily, who initially refused to participate in anything so dangerous. The argument between the twins lasted only seconds, but it felt like an eternity as precious time slipped away. Finally, Lily agreed to help, not because she thought the plan would work, but because she couldn't bear the thought of abandoning her sister when Emma was determined to act. The twins had always faced everything together, and this terrifying morning would be no different. Emma pulled her cell phone from her backpack, the device their mother had given them for emergencies only. Her hands shook as she tried to dial 911, but she quickly realized that making a phone call would create noise that might alert the criminals to their presence. Instead, she switched to text messaging, typing the most important message of her young life. The text was simple and direct. 2 police officers trapped in old warehouse on Industrial Street. 3 bad men going to burn building. Send help now. This is real. She sent the message to 911, praying that the emergency text system would work the way her teacher had explained during their safety presentations at school. But Emma knew that help might not arrive in time, and she refused to stand by helplessly while 2 innocent people burned to death. She looked at her sister, at Max, and then back at the warehouse where 2 lives hung in the balance. The next few minutes would determine whether courage could triumph over evil and whether 2 12-year-old girls and their dog could accomplish what seemed impossible. Emma's mind raced as she tried to think of a way to help the trapped officers without getting herself and Lily killed in the process. She had always been the twin who jumped first and thought about consequences later, but now she forced herself to slow down and consider their options carefully. 2 lives depended on making the right choice. The warehouse had multiple broken windows, but most of them were too high off the ground for the girls to reach. However, Emma remembered seeing a loading dock on the far side of the building during her previous explorations of the neighborhood. If they could get to that area without being spotted, they might be able to find a way inside. Lily grabbed her sister's arm, her voice barely a whisper. "This is crazy, Emma, we're just kids. We should wait for the police to come." But even as she spoke the words, both girls could smell the gasoline fumes getting stronger, and they could hear Danny Morrison's voice inside the warehouse, telling his partners that it was almost time to light the fire. Max seemed to sense what the girls were planning, and he positioned himself to lead the way around the building. The golden retriever moved with surprising stealth for such a large dog, keeping low to the ground and pausing frequently to listen for sounds that might indicate danger. His protective instincts had transformed him from a playful family pet into a focused guardian. The loading dock was partially collapsed, with chunks of concrete creating a makeshift stairway that led to a door that hung crooked on broken hinges. Emma tested each piece of debris before putting her full weight on it, remembering her mother's warnings about the structural integrity of the old building. The last thing they needed was to cause a loud crash that would alert the criminals to their presence. Inside the warehouse, tensions were rising among the 3 escaped convicts. Tommy Walsh's nervousness had escalated to near panic, and he kept insisting that they should just leave the officers tied up and escape while they still could. He didn't want to be responsible for killing 2 police officers, and he was terrified of what would happen if they were caught. Rick Henderson disagreed with Tommy's concerns, arguing that dead officers couldn't identify them or testify against them in court. His brutal pragmatism came from years of violent crime, and he saw murder as just another tool to ensure their freedom. The large man's criminal record already included several assaults, and adding homicide wouldn't significantly change his potential sentence if caught. Danny Morrison listened to his partner's argument with growing impatience. He had been planning this moment for weeks, and he wasn't about to let anyone's squeamishness interfere with his artistic vision. The arsonist pulled out his lighter and flicked it several times, watching the flame dance in the dim warehouse lighting. Soon, much larger flames would be dancing throughout the entire building. Mike Rodriguez had managed to work one hand partially free from his restraints, but the rope was still too tight for him to escape completely. He could see that Sarah was struggling with her own bonds, and both officers were desperately trying to communicate with their eyes, since they couldn't speak through the tape covering their mouths. They had to find a way to work together if they were going to survive the next few minutes. Emma squeezed through the partially open loading dock door, with Lily reluctantly following behind her. The inside of the warehouse was even more frightening than what they had seen through the window. The smell of gasoline was overwhelming, and they could see the wet trails where Danny had poured his accelerants in carefully planned patterns across the floor. The girls positioned themselves behind a stack of old wooden pallets that provided cover while still allowing them to see the tied-up officers. Emma studied the layout of the warehouse, looking for anything that might help with their rescue plan. She noticed several pieces of broken metal and glass scattered around the floor, potential weapons if they became desperate enough to use them. Max had followed the girls inside, but the dog was clearly agitated by all the unfamiliar smells and the obvious tension in the air. Emma knew they had to act quickly, before Max's protective instincts caused him to bark or growl, which would immediately give away their position to the 3 criminals. The plan that formed in Emma's mind was incredibly risky, but it was the only option she could think of that had any chance of success. She would create a distraction that would draw at least one of the criminals away from the officers, giving Lily a chance to slip in and start cutting the restraints with a piece of broken glass she had found. Lily shook her head frantically when Emma explained the plan, pointing out all the ways it could go wrong and get them all killed. But Emma had already made up her mind, and she reminded her sister that they couldn't live with themselves if they did nothing and watched 2 innocent people burn to death. The distraction Emma had in mind involved Max, whose protective instincts could be channeled into aggressive action if properly motivated. She whispered instructions to the golden retriever, hoping that his intelligence and training would be enough to make her desperate plan work. Danny Morrison had finished his preparations and was walking toward the center of the warehouse with his lighter held high like a torch. He paused dramatically, savoring the moment before he would transform his careful planning into a roaring inferno. This fire would be different from all his previous works of destruction. It would have human subjects trapped within its flames, making it his most ambitious and horrifying creation. Mike and Sarah both struggled harder against their restraints as they saw Danny approaching with the lighter. They knew they had only seconds left before the warehouse became their funeral pyre, and desperation gave them strength they didn't know they possessed. But the ropes held firm, and the tape over their mouths prevented them from making any sound that might attract help. Emma took a deep breath and prepared to put her plan into action. She knew they would probably only get one chance to save the officers, and if they failed, all 5 of them might die in the fire that was about to consume the warehouse. But the 12-year-old girl refused to let fear paralyze her when action was the only thing that stood between life and death. She looked at Lily one last time, seeing her own terror reflected in her twin sister's eyes, but also seeing the determination that had always made them stronger together than either could be alone. Max tensed beside them, ready to spring into action the moment Emma gave him the signal. The warehouse fell silent, except for the sound of Danny's footsteps approaching the tied-up officers and the nervous breathing of 2 frightened girls who were about to attempt the impossible. Emma gave Max the signal by pointing toward Tommy Walsh, who was positioned near the main entrance and appeared to be the most nervous of the 3 criminals. She whispered the attack command that their neighbor had taught her when Max was just a puppy, hoping the golden retriever remembered his basic protection training, despite never having used it in a real situation. Max exploded from behind the wooden pallets like a furry missile, his powerful legs carrying him across the warehouse floor in seconds. The dog's sudden appearance and aggressive charge caught all 3 criminals completely off guard. But Tommy bore the brunt of the attack as 80 pounds of determined golden retriever slammed into his chest and knocked him backward into a pile of debris. The young criminal screamed in terror and pain as Max's teeth found his arm, clamping down with enough force to make him drop the coil of rope he had been holding. Tommy had always been afraid of dogs, and his panic made it impossible for him to think clearly about defending himself against the unexpected attack. Rick Henderson spun toward the commotion with his gun raised, but he couldn't get a clear shot at the dog without risking hitting his partner. He shouted at Danny to forget about the fire and help him deal with the animal, but the arsonist was too focused on his lighter to pay immediate attention to what was happening behind him. Emma used the distraction to signal Lily, who crept out from their hiding place with a sharp piece of broken glass clutched in her trembling hand. The cautious twin had never done anything remotely this dangerous in her entire life, but she forced herself to move toward the tied-up officers while the criminals were focused on the chaos Max was creating. Officer Sarah Chen saw Lily approaching and tried to communicate through her eyes that the girl should cut Mike's restraints first, since he was larger and stronger, and would have a better chance of overpowering their captors once he was free. Lily understood immediately and changed direction, crawling on her hands and knees to avoid being seen by Rick or Danny. The broken glass was sharper than Lily had expected, and she had to be careful not to cut herself as she worked on the rope binding Mike's wrists. Her hands shook so badly that she almost dropped the improvised knife several times, but she forced herself to keep working despite the terror that threatened to overwhelm her completely. Mike felt the rope beginning to loosen and used his police training to help Lily by positioning his wrists to give her better access to the bonds. He could see that Rick was trying to line up a shot at Max, and he knew they only had seconds before the situation escalated into deadly violence. Tommy's screams had become so loud that they echoed throughout the warehouse, and his blood was beginning to stain Max's golden fur as the dog maintained his protective grip. The golden retriever had never attacked a human being before, but his instincts told him that these men represented a mortal threat to his beloved family, and he was prepared to fight to the death if necessary. Danny Morrison finally realized that his perfect plan was falling apart, and he turned away from the gasoline-soaked area where he had been preparing to start his fire. The arsonist's face was twisted with rage at having his artistic moment interrupted by a dog and what appeared to be children hiding somewhere in his carefully prepared stage. Rick finally got the angle he needed and fired his stolen pistol at Max. But his aim was thrown off by Tommy's thrashing and the poor lighting in the warehouse. The bullet ricocheted off a metal support beam and embedded itself in a wooden pallet just inches from where Emma was crouched in terror. The gunshot was deafeningly loud in the enclosed space, and it galvanized everyone into faster action. Lily managed to cut through the last strand of rope binding Mike's wrists, and the officer immediately began working to free his ankles while she moved toward Sarah to cut her restraints as well. Emma knew she had to do something to help Max, who was still struggling with Tommy, but would be defenseless if Rick got a clear shot at him. She grabbed a handful of the broken glass and metal debris from around her hiding place and began throwing it at the gunman, hoping to disrupt his aim long enough for the others to escape. Her improvised missiles weren't particularly accurate, but they served their purpose by forcing Rick to duck and move, making it impossible for him to line up another shot at the dog. One piece of metal struck him in the shoulder hard enough to draw blood, and his angry shout filled the warehouse as he realized that children were somehow involved in ruining their escape. Danny Morrison had seen enough chaos and destruction to recognize when a situation was beyond salvage. He flicked his lighter and dropped it into the nearest pool of gasoline, determined that if he couldn't have his perfect fire with living victims, he would at least destroy all the evidence of their failed plan. The flames erupted instantly, spreading along the accelerant trails with frightening speed and filling the warehouse with choking black smoke. The fire was exactly as intense as Danny had planned, and within seconds it was consuming the old wooden structures and creating a wall of heat that made the air almost impossible to breathe. Mike Rodriguez finally freed himself from his ankle restraints and ripped the tape from his mouth, immediately shouting for everyone to get out of the building before the smoke and flames trapped them all inside. He stumbled towards Sarah, who was still partially tied up despite Lily's frantic efforts to cut through her bonds. Emma called for Max to release Tommy and come to her, but the dog was reluctant to give up his protective position. Only when she used the emergency recall command that their mother had drilled into all of them did Max finally let go of the bleeding criminal and bound toward his family. The warehouse had become a death trap in less than a minute, with flames racing along the walls and across the ceiling while thick smoke reduced visibility to just a few feet. Everyone inside faced the same terrible choice. They could try to fight their way through the fire to reach an exit, or they could surrender to the smoke and flames that were rapidly consuming their only refuge. Tommy Walsh was curled up on the floor, clutching his injured arm and sobbing in pain and terror. Rick Henderson had dropped his gun and was stumbling blindly toward what he hoped was the main exit. Danny Morrison stood in the center of his creation like a mad artist admiring his masterpiece, seemingly oblivious to the fact that he was about to be consumed by his own flames. The real test of courage was just beginning, and everyone trapped in the burning warehouse would discover exactly what they were capable of when faced with the ultimate choice between life and death. The heat from Danny's fire was becoming unbearable, and the smoke was so thick that breathing felt like swallowing knives. Emma grabbed Lily's hand and pulled her sister toward where she remembered seeing Officer Mike working to free Officer Sarah. The twins stayed low to the ground where the air was slightly clearer, just as they had learned during fire safety presentations at school. Max bounded ahead of the girls, his superior senses allowing him to navigate through the smoke better than any human could. The golden retriever's protective instincts were in full control now, and he positioned himself to guide his family toward safety while keeping watch for any remaining threats. Officer Mike Rodriguez had finally freed Sarah from her restraints, but both officers were disoriented by the smoke and the chaos of the spreading fire. Mike's training kicked in as he immediately began searching for the quickest route to safety, but the flames had already blocked the main entrance where Rick Henderson had been heading. Sarah pulled the tape from her mouth and shouted over the roar of the fire, telling Mike that she remembered seeing a loading dock on the east side of the building during their initial surveillance of the warehouse. It was their best hope for finding an exit that wasn't already consumed by flames. Emma and Lily reached the officers just as Mike was helping Sarah to her feet. The 12-year-old girls looked impossibly small and vulnerable in the hellish environment Danny had created, but their eyes burned with determination that impressed both experienced police officers. These children had risked everything to save them, and Mike was determined that their courage wouldn't be wasted. "Follow me," Emma shouted over the crackling flames, pointing toward the loading dock where she and Lily had entered the warehouse. "We know the way out." The girl's voice was hoarse from the smoke, but her leadership in this moment of crisis was unmistakable. The small group moved together through the burning warehouse, with Max leading the way and the two officers protecting the twins from falling debris. Chunks of burning wood were beginning to fall from the ceiling as the fire weakened the building's structural supports, and each step became more dangerous than the last. Danny Morrison had finally realized that his artistic fire was going to kill him along with everyone else if he didn't escape immediately. The arsonist stumbled through the smoke, coughing and gasping as he searched desperately for an exit he could no longer see. His moment of triumph had become his potential doom, and the irony wasn't lost on him even as he fought for his life. Rick Henderson had reached what he thought was the main entrance, only to discover that the doorway was completely blocked by flames. The large criminal was tough enough to survive almost any fight, but fire was an enemy that couldn't be intimidated or overpowered. He turned back into the warehouse looking for another way out, his gun forgotten in his desperate scramble for survival. Tommy Walsh remained curled up on the floor where Max had left him, his injured arm bleeding freely and his mind paralyzed by terror. The young criminal had given up any hope of escape and was simply waiting for the fire to reach him. His sobs were lost in the roar of the flames that continued to spread with frightening speed. Emma led the group toward the loading dock, but when they arrived, they discovered that falling debris had partially blocked their escape route. The doorway was still passable, but they would have to crawl through a narrow gap between burning beams and twisted metal. It would be dangerous for adults and potentially impossible for the two girls. Officer Sarah Chen immediately volunteered to go first, using her smaller frame to test whether the passage was safe for the twins. She squeezed through the gap with Mike pushing from behind, and once she was safely outside, she called back that the others could follow the same path. Lily went next, her natural caution serving her well as she carefully navigated around the sharp edges and hot metal. Emma pushed her sister from behind, making sure Lily didn't panic and get stuck in the narrow opening. Max squeezed through after the girls, his thick fur protecting him from the worst of the heat. Mike Rodriguez was the last to attempt the escape, and his larger frame made the passage much more difficult. Halfway through, a burning beam shifted and nearly crushed his leg, but Sarah and the twins grabbed his arms and pulled him free just in time. The warehouse was collapsing around them as they finally stumbled into the fresh air outside. The sound of approaching sirens filled the air as fire trucks and police cars raced toward the warehouse district. Emma's emergency text message had been received and taken seriously by the 911 dispatcher, and help was finally arriving. But it was the courage of two young girls and their faithful dog that had made the difference between life and death. Danny Morrison never made it out of the warehouse. The arsonist who had spent his career creating fires was ultimately consumed by his own flames, trapped in the center of his final masterpiece as the building collapsed around him. Rick Henderson was found unconscious near the blocked main entrance, alive but severely burned and smoke-damaged. Tommy Walsh was pulled from the wreckage by firefighters who heard his cries for help. The young criminal survived with serious injuries, and his brush with death convinced him to cooperate fully with police investigators. He provided testimony that led to the capture of several other escaped convicts and the resolution of multiple unsolved crimes. Officer Mike Rodriguez and Officer Sarah Chen were treated for smoke inhalation and minor injuries, but both made full recoveries. They recommended Emma and Lily Parker for the department's highest civilian honors, though both girls insisted that Max deserved equal recognition for his heroic actions. The story of what happened in the burning warehouse spread throughout the community and eventually across the nation. Two 12-year-old twins had faced the ultimate test of courage and refused to abandon those in need. Even when doing so, put their own lives at risk. Their actions proved that heroism isn't determined by age or size, but by the willingness to do what's right, regardless of the cost. Emma and Lily returned to their normal lives as middle school students, but they were forever changed by their experience. They had learned that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary things when circumstances demand it, and that the bonds between family members can provide strength that seems impossible until it's needed most. Max received a special commendation from the police department and a year's supply of his favorite dog treats. The golden retriever seemed to understand that he was being honored for his protective actions, and his tail wagged proudly during the ceremony. He continued to watch over the Parker twins with the same devotion he had shown that terrible morning. though hopefully he would never again be called upon to demonstrate such fierce courage. The abandoned warehouse was completely destroyed by the fire, but the empty lot where it once stood became a small park, dedicated to community heroes. A plaque near the playground told the story of two girls and their dog, who proved that courage comes in all sizes, and that sometimes the most unlikely heroes are the ones who make the biggest difference when it matters most. Years later, when Emma and Lily Parker told this story to their own children, they always emphasized the same lesson, that everyone has the potential to be a hero when others need help, and that the size of your heart matters far more than the size of your body when courage is called for in the face of impossible odds.